Guys, today we're going to be taking a look at Dragon's Breath, but in its final form. Now, for those that don't know, this is the Season 23 Season Pass exotic. Now, it was actually an old exotic back in Destiny 1, and a lot of people forget, but it dropped as early as the Dart Below. Now, its original design made it shoot the equivalent of what we know today as solar grenades, only much worse. Now, Bungie actually reworked it back in D1, where it would shoot a fiery canister that left behind a trail of flame and detonated when the player released the trigger. This would essentially be the foundation for the version that we see today. And fellas, let me tell you, Dragon's Breath has never been better. Now, this time around, Dragon's Breath now sticks a rocket into enemies that belches flames, scorching them as it goes until it finally triggers a chain reaction of ignitions. Think like lasting impressions, but on steroids. Now, how to get this weapon? For those of you that purchased the premium pass, it will be available to you immediately at the start of the season. All you have to do is just claim it from the season pass tab. For those that didn't, this will still be accessible to you via the standard season pass, albeit just a bit later at level 35. Now, once you've collected it, be sure to head to Banshee in the tower, pick up the quest for the exotic catalyst, as you want to start that as soon as you can, as the catalysts for the season pass exotics normally are pretty grindy, but relatively the same every season. The first step of the catalyst will ask you to defeat 50 enemies with scorched damage and take down 5 bosses. You can honestly do this anywhere, guys, whether that's in the Vanguard playlist or Riven's Lair, the Coil. A few runs of either of these will complete that step. Now, step 2 is where things get painful, as you'll need to collect 200 calibration data and defeat 450 targets with Dragon's Breath. Now, calibration happens when you complete Vanguard operations, Crucible, and Gambit matches, or seasonal playlist activities. Now, higher tier Nightfalls, Crucible, and Gambit wins, as well as defeating Guardians, offer additional progress. Now, you're going to need anywhere between 30 to 50 completions, regardless of the activity you partake in. Honestly, guys, just do this naturally. Don't sit down and go, yo, I'm going to do 40 games of Gambit non-stop. Good God. Now, there is an upgrade on your season pass, which substantially helps with this grind, but it is still going to be a number of games. Now, upon completing this step, you'll be greeted with one more step, and that's just to get kills with Dragon's Breath anywhere in the game. Load up into Sure Achieve you want, and you can knock it out in the catalyst very quickly. Now, let's get into the exotic breakdown, and of course, the catalyst itself. First up, its exotic perk, Composite Propellant, reads, rockets embed themselves in struck targets and periodically eject incendiary fuel that inflicts scorch. The longer this weapon goes without firing, the more fuel the next rocket contains. Now, this works on a 1 to 5 stack system, with each stack taking about 3 seconds if left alone, meaning you will always have at least 1 stack of fuel in each rocket, which will scorch and ignite the target for about 6.5 seconds. But your goal is always going to be reaching that level 5 fuel stack so that you can apply that damage and scorch for a maximum of 12 seconds. Because you just said that it takes 15 seconds to reach maximum stacks. So last time I checked, that's longer than Scorch lasts. But that's where the second perk, High Octane, comes into play, which says igniting nearby targets partially replenishes fuel. Now, when we pair this with the exotic catalyst, which grants us the perk Pyromancer, it states that this weapon replenishes its fuel faster. Defeating targets with this weapon causes them to periodically drop fire sprites. There it is, guys. That is your gameplay loop. Shooting a target or a group of ads will scorch them, and as they're crisping up, you swap to a different weapon, use an ability, grab a snack, but then they will ignite, which will add stacks of fuel to your Dragon's Breath, which will then reload your weapon for you, which will allow you to swap right back and fire again, and rinse and repeat until everything around you is no longer there. And believe me, this is blowing my mind as much as it's blowing yours. I was under the assumption Dragon's Breath was not going to be that good. I was like, there's no way. But this also takes us to our performance and damage, because we got to draw comps here. You want to see the actual damage numbers in comparison to other weapons. Now, before we get into the raw numbers, I need to preface this by saying that this is a utility exotic. Now, what I mean by that is that yes, it does do a lot of damage, but consider it more like Witherhorde, Anarchy, Izanagi's Burden, even Galahorn. It has that ability to crank out some nasty damage, especially when you build into it. But where you get the most out of this weapon is when you combine it with other weapons and abilities. We did a damage test on Greg, which is purely a DPS snip to show you roughly what all your weapons look like. The problem with that, and I even mentioned in that damage testing, was that we were using Dragon's Breath not in the way that it was optimized for. Granted, we were doing a rocket side-by-side comparison, so everybody just wanted to see rocket damage versus rocket damage, and so that's what we did. But the point I'm trying to make is that this is an exotic, much like Anarchy in a lot of ways, where you place a shot and then you swap to another weapon and you continue to do damage. And this means you're gonna have substantially better total damage overall. Now, starting off with just the base rocket itself. Testing on Greg, we found found that our rocket here has an impact damage of 14,284. Once stuck on Greg, that will begin to simultaneously add scorch stacks and apply 3 alternating burn damage numbers for that 12 seconds, which will rotate between 2,336 damage and 1,336, as well as a 749 in there. Now, once those scorch stacks reach 100, the first ignition will proc for 26,639. Now, this scorch, burn, and ignite cycle will repeat until the rocket dies out, totaling to a whopping 129,511 damage. And that's just for a single shot. Now, what does this look like in context to some of our other popular rocket launchers, especially other exotic rocket launchers? As it turns out, Dragon's Breath lands itself as the highest total damage exotic rocket launcher, with Deathbringer and Two-Tailed Fox following closely behind. Adding legendary rocket launchers into the mix, Dragon's Breath actually tested second overall for total damage, losing only barely to a bait-and-switch Wolfpack round Apex Predator, which dished out about 131,463 damage per shot. Deathbringer comes in third, and an explosive light Wolfpack round Hothead sneaks its way into fourth, dealing 111,904 damage per shot. Now, for the ugly. As we mentioned before, this damage is getting dealt over a 12-second period. Unfortunately, this of course kills your DPS. Matter of fact, we're looking at a DPS value of 32,377 damage. This is so bad that the only weapon it could out DPS in our testing was Truth. I know, some of you probably clicked off right now, like, nope, I don't need to see any more Cross. That being said though, we mentioned earlier that this was more of a utility exotic, so that low DPS number isn't scaring us off just yet. And it shouldn't for you either, especially when you start hearing about all the juicy interactions it has with this season's artifact mods and solar subclasses. First, let's talk about artifact interactions. Considering how long this season is going to be, you guys better get very comfy with this artifact. I'm going to start with column 2 though. We have an artifact mod called Blast Radius. Now this one's pretty straightforward. Fire your rocket into a group of ads or an ad spawn or anywhere you know that they're likely to congregate, and you'll start raking in that armor charge. Anything that dies from your rocket's impact damage, burn damage, or ignitions is going to count for those kills needed to accrue that charge, which can feed into your builds or back into the rocket itself, especially with Argent Ordnance, which is in column 5. Now, right next to Blast Radius is going to be a mod I would highly recommend for this weapon, Kindling Trigger. Now, we broke down exactly how this mod works in our Season 23 Artifact mod video. By the way, check that out. We go through everything, all the numbers, all the buffs, all the debuffs, and even the stacking capabilities. But what Kindling Trigger essentially does is that it moves the starting point for your Scorch stacks. Now, this applies to weapons that already apply Scorch, and it applies to weapons that don't apply Scorch. Now, keep in mind, this mod will not net you an ignition on its own. It just moves the starting points, and of course, tacks on damage. But if you have a weapon, such as Dragon's Breath here, or even Skyburner's Oath, Prometheus Lens, etc., that applies Scorch naturally, this just means a faster ignition will be achieved. Now, this means that with this mod, that first ignition time is reduced from 3 seconds to a second and a half. A second and a half! Is anybody else turned on right now? Now, this will allow your rocket to reach those fuel stacks even faster, therefore reloading itself and readying you for that next damage cycle. Now, you might be wondering why we're stressing the catalyst so much, especially compared to other weapons. And that's because it's an absolute must-have for Dragon's Breath, as it halves the amount of time it takes for this weapon to build stacks by itself, reducing that time from 27 seconds all the way down to 15 seconds, meaning you can fire this far more often and get the best results. Now, you're gonna hear me harping about reaching max stacks of composite propellants several times throughout this video, as it directly correlates to how many times that rocket will release those scorch bursts. Quite literally, one stack will release that scorching burst one time, and then the rocket will explode, whereas 5 stacks will burst 5 times and then explode. So if you're firing your rocket as quickly as possible without max stacks, you're losing out on all that additional burn and ignition damage. Now, moving to column 3, we have the mod Torch, which states that while Radiant, you deal increased damage to combatants affected by Strand and Stasis debuffs. Now, this perk gives you a flat 5% buff on top of the 25% buff you receive from Radiant, giving us a 30% damage buff. Remember how I said this was more like an Anarchy or a Witherhoard? This is where it really comes into play, by equipping something like Riptide, or even one of the new Strand weapons that comes with Slice, such as the Scatter Signal Fusion Rifle, and applying those debuffs. You'll be adding on a nice chunk of damage for your rockets as well as your teammates' weapons. Now, if you don't have either of those, you got the Airmite Fusion Rifle from last season, which works really nicely. Working our way into longer range options, you got things like Supremacy with Bait and Switch, one of my favorites, Succession, the Icolo Sniper, and when doing our damage testing, you see Supremacy obviously at the top of the list, so I highly recommend it here. Now back to the artifact. Now moving on to column 4, we have Overload rocket launchers. Now I know what you're thinking. Cross, have you seen how those champions move? Overload champions are no joke, man, and you're expecting me to hit them with a rocket? Now I need you to look at the perk text real quick. It states that rocket launchers are especially effective against Overload champions. What it doesn't say is that it's a 139.71% damage increase from base with this rocket launcher. Now listen, if that damage number sounds funky, keep in mind, artifact perks means those weapons are overcharged for particular activities. Now why it's giving us almost 140% increase in damage, I don't know. We went into some Master Law sectors, we were minus 19 power under, and we were nuking champions into the ground with Dragon's Breath. We're talking 1 rocket, 1 kill. The damage buff doesn't apply just to impact, but it also applies to the burn and ignition damage as well. Speaking of which, Dragon's Breath actually has the ability to stun unstoppable champions. And that's because of that ignition, which you can get in a second and a half, will stun unstops, which will then allow you to do some serious damage with that remaining burn and ignition, especially if there are adds around that can chain those ignitions as well. Now moving on to column 5. One of the best artifact mods this season is Argent Ordnance. Now we mentioned this earlier in our breakdown, but essentially guys, it gives you a 15% buff. Stackable, by the way. This applies both to impact and explosion damage. Also applies to Wolfpack rounds. And just like in our previous example, also applies to burn and ignition damage for Dragon's Breath. Remember our damage numbers on Greg earlier? Well, with Argent Ordnance equipped, that 15% buff brings the total damage up to 144,985 damage per shot. Now guys, it doesn't stop there. There's one more piece of the puzzle that brings it all together, and that's Solo Operative. This will further stack with Argent Ordnance, Surges, Wells, Radiant, and whatever else you want. And our testing on Greg showed that with these 2 mods alone, you're looking at a single shot damage of 194,628, roughly a 32.25% increase in damage, and we're not even stacking on things like Surges or Well. Now, a few more things to mention before we move on from the artifact mods is that this exotic unfortunately does not work with Revitalizing Blasts, meaning that its ignitions are not the same as a solar ability, therefore will not weaken the target. So you will have to apply that manually. Similarly, the ignitions are staggered, and during our testing, we found that the first ignition of Chain will receive that 15% buff. The following ignitions will go to the damage tier below your current damage stack. I know! Now let's talk Solar 3.0 interactions. Beside a large amount of interactions with this season's artifact, Dragon's Breath also synergizes quite well with Solar 3.0 and can be very potent with the right things. Let's start with Ember of Singeing, which reads, your class ability recharges faster when you scorch targets. Now, when you land a rocket on a boss or any enemy with enough health to have a full cycle of Dragon's Breath, this will give you up to 12 seconds of Scorch, which essentially means your class ability is almost always up. Now, you have Ember of Char, which states that your solar ignition spreads Scorch to affected targets. Now, once your ignition procs from Dragon's Breath, all the adds within vicinity will die to the ignition itself or have Scorch apply to them, which will then further chain into another ignition. Then we have Ember of Eruption, which increases the blast radius of those Dragon Breath ignitions, as well as Ember of Blistering, which will grant you grenade energy when you defeat targets with those ignitions. You see where we're going with this, guys? Basically, all of Solar 3.0 will synergize with this weapon into chaining explosions, lengthening buffs applied to you, and generating ability energy for you. The list goes on, guys. The final fragment I would like to call special attention to is Ember of Ashes, which allows you to apply more Scorch stacks to targets. Combining this fragment with the seasonal mod Kindling Trigger will allow it to trigger those ignitions much faster and much more consistently on those larger targets and kill the trash adds around those bigger targets much quicker. Lastly, on a similar note to the ignitions not triggering certain artifact perks, you really only want one person on your team using Dragon's Breath, as the Scorch stacks and ignitions do not stack with each other. This was very unfortunate, but that is the current state of Solar 3.0. One of you would simply be stealing the other's potential damage output and of course stealing their mod synergy. And believe me, we've done testing with multiple people rocking Dragon's Breath. It's not good. Hence why I'm like really leaning into like the solo aspect of this rocket launcher, which takes us to our builds, our best use cases, and just a few of our suggestions. First up, I do want to touch on the exotics field. That's important. And I can tell you right now, especially for my D1 vet players, Dragon's Breath here feels substantially better than it ever did back in D1. And I think for anyone rocking Solar 3.0, Dragon's Breath is a must-have in your loadout. Now, as we mentioned before, this is more of a utility exotic and will be up to you on how you decide to use it day to day. Whether that's staggering bosses like the Ogre in the second encounter of the new dungeon, chaining Scorch stacks and ignitions to clear whole rooms of ads and regenerate your abilities, or absolutely melting Overload champions and Grandmasters in low sectors. Regardless of what you choose, be sure to put on Ember of Ashes and Kindling Trigger. This will allow you to take advantage of those ignitions. Now, as far as armor is concerned, you can rock it with exotics like Shards of Galanor, Caliban's Hand, hell, even Foe Tracer for my hunters. For warlocks, you've got Dawn Course, Rain of Fire, Apotheosis Veil. Now, let me just say, Dawn Course doesn't really move the needle all that much. In our damage testing, it wasn't some huge blowout number from Dawn Course, so keep that in mind. But it is an option that does synergize. And for my Titans, you got Precious Scars, Phoenix Cradle, or even Hallowfire Heart to take advantage of those sunspots popping up from all of those ignition and scorch kills. Now, before you run out there and start setting the world on fire, there is one note of caution. That is that this rocket that is being shot out of Dragon's Breath can very much kill you. It's like the one major kryptonite here, right? Nothing sucks worse than placing this thing on a target to have that target walk towards you and then kill you. Not because it kills you, but because the rocket itself killed you. So guys, that is our deep dive review of Dragon's Breath. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching. And as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.